Hello and welcome to The Advance, a weekly broadcast featuring the top policy issue facing the United States. I'm Kevin Roberts, your host, broadcasting from Austin, Texas, where we've been in the news. The state legislature in Texas governing like the conservative majority it is. You've probably seen the national news about a wonderful pro-life bill that became law yesterday. Have a number of other bills that have passed in our special session earlier today, a bill taking on big tech, something that's really important to all of us for the sake of free speech and traditional values. Today, however, we're going to talk about what I would argue is one of the biggest achievements in the last 20 or 25 years in Texas and in other states that have done the same thing, and that's passing election integrity bills. Of course, we're very proud of the reforms we've accomplished here in Texas. There was a little bit of drama if you've been following state and national news. Many of you, if not most of you, tune in from other states. So don't be worried. We're not just going to talk about what's going on in Texas. We'll talk about election reform efforts across the country, including in the nation's capital. But let me warn you, if you don't already know about those election reform efforts in DC, those are bad ones. They would federalize elections, basically rendering meaningless these wonderful reforms that we've done in Texas and Georgia and other states. And so helping me to unpack that and ultimately turning to you, our audience, for questions in just a little bit, are two wonderful guests, good friends, and really important leaders on this issue and others. We have Ken Cuccinelli, former Attorney General of Texas, senior official in President Trump's Department of Homeland Security, and national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. And also joining us, a good friend and someone we work closely with, Garrett Bess, Vice President of Heritage Action for America. Ken, I'm going to turn to you first for the proverbial 30,000-foot view of what's going on with election reform, not just in Texas and not just in DC, but nationwide and almost a couple dozen states this year.
Yeah, incredibly, Kevin, I think the most important word there might just be nationwide. I have never in my entire career at the national level in the conservative movement, 20 years, seen the conservative movement stick together in such, under such withering fire all across the country on a single issue, not a campaign, not for a candidate, but for an issue and a cause, and that is clean, fair, transparent elections. And despite now 8 months and counting, really more than that, of just the entire media enterprise, an enormous amount of money on the left, even occasionally corporate interlopers who never weigh in on our side, weighing in to try to scare legislators and governors and to back off the entire right of center world. And yet we've pressed ahead. And as you said, it isn't just Texas that's seeing success, although there's been tremendous success there in Texas, but Florida, Georgia, Arizona, we can go around the country. We've seen fights that are being carried on in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. And in some of these places, those who are trying to improve voter integrity and voter transparency, like in Michigan and Pennsylvania, are losing. And yet they are going to take up initiatives that they can take straight to the voters for things like voter identification in both of those states. And in fact, the initiative efforts are probably going to be stronger statutorily, stronger constitutionally, because they're initiatives. And in Pennsylvania, it'll probably be done as a constitutional amendment. So there's all sorts of efforts that are going on. And even where setbacks are occurring, they're still regrouping, not giving up, and turning back into the fight. And frankly, and very quietly accomplishing it. The one state that's been bipartisan so far is Kentucky, where some improvements were made with a Democrat governor and Republican legislature. And you didn't hear much about that, which is okay. Things are just running normally there. So other states as well, but there's a lot of good progress, all the while, as you noted, fighting off the far left's effort for a federal takeover in Washington. And that's taken many forms we can talk about as well.
Sure. We'll get into some of those provisions of the nefarious ideas of some of our friends, shall we say, in DC. And for that matter, some of the provisions of the Texas and other state-based laws here in a minute. But before we do that, Garrett, I want to turn to you and ask a similar version of the same question. You know, the role that you and your great colleagues at Heritage Action play is to help activate those people, grassroots activists, regular Americans who are concerned about the future of America and willing to get active on any issue. But to Ken's point, they've been really motivated on the matter of election integrity. And that's what I want to ask you about. Why do you think that is? And what's sort of the scale of this movement that Ken has outlined in terms of the number of people, the number of states, just to give our audience a sense of what y'all are talking about?
Yeah, Kevin, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. I've worked with y'all in Texas, and y'all are on the verge of a big victory there on election integrity. So congratulations to you and your team. And it's been a privilege to work alongside you there. Coming out of the 2020 election, there's a lot of angst and anxiety in the conservative base that we probably don't even have to talk about too much, but it was so visceral. COVID had been used and the government response to COVID had been used for so many different reasons to strip away Americans' rights and abilities to in the case of elections, I would even argue govern themselves the way we're intended to be. And so coming out of that 2020 election in which, various state and local governments and courts got involved and sort of turned election rules on their head at the last minute, in many ways, tilting the landscape toward the left and left-wing candidates. We had a opportunity, but also a responsibility to fight back and to push back against these what the left hoped to be new norms, how we pick our elected leaders. And so everywhere across the country, to specifically answer your question, I mean, we have several million grassroots activists in our organization across the country, and there's not one person in one state who doesn't care deeply about this issue from the conservative perspective. But as an anecdote, Georgia was top of mind for several months right at the beginning of this year, and that's a great success story there because some of the corporate activity that you saw was really, really fun. The governor and the legislature there in Georgia. And, a lot of people don't know this story, but before even organizations like ours, which we were in Georgia, got involved on the ground there, there was a group of conservative activists who basically took recommendations from places like the Heritage Foundation, Honest Elections Project, and others, and put them into a cohesive framework for their own state legislators. And so before we could even stand up a lobbying organization on the ground to support them, before we could stand up a weekly call to help organize and those kinds of things, they were already working on their legislatures. And within a week or so, they had thousands of grassroots activists that had signed on to those reforms, passed them to their own individual state legislators who had started drafting the legislation that ultimately became law in Georgia. And so that's just a great success story, not from organizations like us who do this type of work day in and day out. Those are Americans, and specifically in that case, Georgians, who rose to the occasion and took the responsibility upon themselves and used the energy of coming out of that 2020 election cycle to really reform their own state.
Yeah, and it seems like years ago now that Georgia law was one of the first to get passed, and of course the three of us and many others nationwide working on election reform were commiserating about the scale of pushback from corporate America. Wasn't a surprise for those of us who have been part of organizations who are never going to be supported by those corporations. But these were hundreds of corporations, some of them headquartered in Georgia, who basically were making it impossible for legislators to take hard votes. And yes, they did. And yet they did in Georgia. And this is common sense reform. Like, voter ID for mail-in ballots, using the same requirements for voter identification for a ballot you mail in that you do for voting in person. That's really the core of the reform, as an example, here in Texas. Oh, and by the way, as runaway Democrats here in Texas learned in June and July, all that happened in terms of public support for that provision, voter ID for mail-in ballots, was it went up, including among Democrats. All of that to say, I think one of the key things that we have to continue to do is to remind Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, what these key provisions are in these state-based bills. I want to do that in a minute with the DC reforms by the other side. But Ken, I'd like to turn to you first, and Garrett, I'll come back to you on this question too. Just highlight the 2 or 3 or 4 most important provisions across the state bills when it comes to election integrity.
Sure. Well, certainly one common theme you see, and it takes different forms in different states, is photo ID, voter ID. Particularly with the explosion of, I'll call it non-conventional voting, mail-in voting, early voting, those sorts of things. To equalize, in many states, they're not imposing identification requirements so much as they are equalizing the security requirements for identification for their mail-in votes as they already have for their in-person voting. And obviously, if you're there in person and showing your identification, they can compare it to you if it's a photo ID. They still will not have that opportunity with respect to mail-in votes. Nonetheless, it is a level of security measure that makes large-scale fraud extremely difficult. I mean, I won't say it wipes it out, but it's pretty thorough. So that's a common theme, Kevin, across the states. And it's amazing the fight that has taken place over that. It's a great example of how the left uses narrative as distinguished from argument. Narrative doesn't require any basis in truth or fact. It's a story, and it's a political story, and it's the same story they've been telling for 2 decades to try to scare their own base. And that is that those nasty right-wingers are trying to suppress your vote by requiring voter identification. Their problem is minorities look around and they're like, well, I have an ID. I can get this. This isn't a problem. And that's what the polling shows across the country. I mean, literally into the 80%. Most recent poll that I've seen the details on is over 80% supportive of this. So, but what's been going on is people like Beto O'Rourke in your state, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Jim Clyburn, the dean of the Black Caucus in the House, and the list goes on. Joe Biden, the president of the United States, Vice President Harris, have been calling this Jim Crow, or meaning relating back to the old bars to voting by Black citizens, or just voter suppression, just plain old. But when Joe Manchin suddenly required it as part of his compromise for the first federal takeover attempt, all of a sudden the Stacey Abrams, Jim Clyburn's, Vice President Harris of the world, they all flipped. They literally said things like, well, we never said voter ID was racist. It was so bad that even the Washington Post had to give them 4 Pinocchios, which is their pants on fire rating in fact checking. I mean, it was completely baseless, and we get this all over the place. So there's other provisions are tightening up early voting periods, which is a security nightmare. Early voting is a security and transparency nightmare. And chain of custody requirements, signature requirements. Again, these are things that when you ask Americans, most of them say, don't we already do this? They're literally so common sense and nonpartisan. It's only when you apply the R's and the D's to the arguments where people start breaking away and polarizing. But Americans have an overwhelming agreement on what it takes to run a good election. And those are the kinds of reforms you're seeing put in place in Iowa and Georgia and Texas and Arizona, and to give more transparency. guaranteeing state legislatures a seat at the table when there's litigation. Sorry, not legislation, litigation. Providing more transparency for that chain of custody to give whoever loses more confidence that the accurate outcome was reached. And that's really the ultimate goal and the ultimate measure of success, is with those transparency elements that are being put forward. Does this provide confidence even to the losing side in any given election? And that's the way our systems should run, but they really haven't in the past.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm glad, by the way, that you mentioned the word litigation, because I'm going to come back to you to sort of forecast for us what litigation looks like when it comes to defending or even attacking some of these common sense election reforms at the state level. By the way, if you're tuning into this and you have a question for Ken or for Garrett, you can go into the comment section of whatever social media channel you're using and pose that. We'll get to that in just a minute. But Garrett, before we turn to the audience for questions, I want to come back to you and talk about DC. And in particular, given the great work that your organization does, not just in the states, but also nationwide and with federal legislation, give us a state of play here in early September regarding federalizing elections, or at least the proposals to do so, some of the key provisions as well that really would be very harmful to the progress that's been made by state legislatures.
Yeah, sure. And real quickly, I actually really appreciate what Ken just said about giving confidence to the losing side in an election. I mean, all of us have been involved in elections, and it is hard to lose an election that you've put so much time and effort into. But if you have a question as to the veracity of that election, that is almost unpalatable situation. And so it's really important that we have an election system that is transparent, that makes it easy to vote and hard to cheat, so that even when we do lose an election, which will happen, that we have confidence that it was decided fairly. In DC, I mean, the 30,000 foot level is that DC Democrats are determined to overturn all of these election reforms that have been accomplished in the states. In some ways, advance really bad ideas, sort of the other direction. Really interesting. This news came out the other day, and we're trying to get our hands on the actual memo. But there was apparently a memo that was written during the President Obama administration that outlined a set of things that have to happen in order for Democrats to win elections sort of in perpetuity. And a huge chunk of those items in that memo actually manifested themselves in H.R. 1 that Nancy Pelosi introduced at the beginning of this Congress. Now, H.R. 1 is one bill, H.R. 4 is another bill, and then there is a current sort of a budget negotiation that's going on that I'll sort of address thirdly. But H.R. 1, basically, if you could imagine the worst possible election scenario, you've imagined H.R. 1. I mean, it would require same-day registration. It would prohibit voter identification. It would require the counting of ballots being cast on the spot. So let's just take those three provisions for a second, because there's so many more in that bill. But I could walk into my local precinct. I could register to vote on the spot. They couldn't check my identity to clarify whether I am who I'm claiming to be on the spot. And then I could immediately cast a ballot. Now, there is nothing that would prohibit me then from going down the street. I live in a very populated area. I have actually, at the voting precinct I go to, there's a voting precinct immediately next door. And so I could actually go in a few short hours and probably cast tens, if not close to 100 different ballots precincts if I wanted to under that scenario. So you can just imagine how few nefarious actors it would take to start really taking advantage of some of those provisions. Fortunately, I think is so extreme that largely H.R. 1 has been killed off. Now, we need to remain vigilant because they're still trying to do similar things. But that brings us to H.R. 4. And H.R. 4 is a little bit of a sneakier way to get similar results to H.R. 1. And what H.R. 4 essentially would do is it would overturn a 2013 Supreme Court decision that essentially said that some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act were no longer applicable in the modern era. And it would overturn that and then sort of apply a very, very loose standard to the states. So loose that what it would do is allow any jurisdiction that gets sued a certain number of times, not adjudicated guilty, not all the way through the process. And we learned some bad things about that municipality, county, or whatever, but simply sued a certain number of times puts you under the authority of the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice then, for lack of a better word, can veto any sort of election changes that you make for that region or that state or that municipality. And so it's just a terrible, terrible bill. They're hoping to attach the sentiment around historical racism in the U.S. and in particular around voting in the U.S. To ram through this H.R. 4. We're fighting a hard fight on that one. This fight is not won yet. But that brings us to the third item, and that is the budget bill. In Congress, there is a process that is unlike any other budgeting process you could ever imagine in the world. And that is we pass a budget resolution, and then every budget resolution has the opportunity to then have what is called a reconciliation bill. And the short understanding of the reconciliation bill is it gets around the filibuster in the Senate. So it's an extremely powerful tool. Democrats in the budget resolution instructed the judiciary committees to write legislation giving them a certain amount of money to accomplish what they hope to accomplish in the arena of voting rights. Now, knowing what Democrats and the left mean by voting rights, we have to assume that over the coming 3 or 4 weeks, we are going to see a reconciliation bill that comes out of probably the House to start with, that will try to accomplish things in H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 through spending mechanisms that they will hope to, at least at the bare minimum, tie up in courts endlessly, similar to what they did to voter ID in North Carolina. So that these election reforms that we've worked so hard on across the states actually never take effect for an election in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Garrett, I appreciate so much, and I'm sure our audience does, how thorough your summary is of what's going on in DC. The headline I might write is they're attacking common sense current election law and practice on every front. And we have to be vigilant. We've had some victories there, thank goodness for the work of the two of you and others, but we can't give up. We can't quit, even though we've had some success. So we're going to turn to audience questions. And the first one, Ken, is going to come to you. It's actually a question I was going to ask you, but as you will find, gentlemen, our audience is smarter than me. This audience member asks, you were the Attorney General of Virginia. You are an attorney. Give us a sense of what's going to happen with litigation against some of these state election reform bills.
So first of all, understand that, there are opportunistic lawyers who view these as just, if nothing else, a business opportunity. Now, and the left on the litigation front, unlike the right, is phenomenally well funded. There's legal news today about the lead Democrat law firm that is spun off its elections law group, and it's literally like 60 or 70 lawyers just in one firm. And this is all they do. And they've made hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars in the last couple of years. That's an awful lot of money to turn on litigation. And of course, Texas is going to be sued to the extent it hasn't already been sued for these laws, just like Georgia has and so forth. It's almost automatic. It's literally become part of the process. But because there isn't pre-clearance anymore, because of the 2013 case that Garrett referenced, that the Supreme Court said, pre-clearance as they were using it was unconstitutional. And Texas, like Virginia, was covered by that. That now there is only Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that discrimination in elections is illegal. And I'm sure that's something we all agree on and support. Why anyone thinks we should have to renew that concept every 15, 20, 25 years, as opposed to just making it permanent. I don't know. But the Supreme Court, just at the end of June in the Brnovich case coming out of Arizona, really put some guardrails around what it means to accuse a state of discrimination in its laws. And it was very helpful guidance, both in terms of how data is handled and the what you have to prove. And strangely enough, you have to prove, well, discrimination, which the left objects to having to prove discrimination to get a finding of discrimination. And that sounds crazy, but that is exactly where they are. And so when you hear them sort of screaming in the litigation arena, what they want to do is they want to be able to impute racism to a state like Texas and their legislature simply because they passed a bill like they just did. And that is beyond what is allowable according to the Supreme Court. And we're going to see, and it's really too soon after the Supreme Court's ruling to be able to see it clearly, but we're going to see in the Georgia case, in the suits coming for Texas and so forth, just what the courts think the Supreme Court meant for them. And I believe, as a litigator and as an attorney general who dealt with pre-clearance, and Virginia was a Voting Rights Act target state for good reason, that we're going to see these sorts of efforts taken just as we all believe them to be. Sincere efforts to clean up our elections, to have clean elections that can be clearly seen as such, that everyone has equal access to. That's why we say so often, easy to vote and hard to cheat. That's our goal. And I told you my additional goal is that even the losers can have confidence in the outcome of these elections. I would point to Florida in 2020 with all of the problems all over the country in 2020 with the new COVID sudden voting rules or lack of rules. The largest swing state, Florida, third largest state overall, cleanly counted their votes on election night. No complaints from either side. Well, why was that? 21 years ago, we all remember Bush v. Gore and the disaster, and frankly, the joke that everybody saw Florida's election system was. Well, what did they do? They set about fixing it. And they did it. They achieved it. They made it one of the best systems, I think, in the country, certainly among any large state. And yet they went back this year and improved it even further. Mm-hmm. So we know we can fix these problems. And we know that litigation is going to come because the direction of what we call fixing, which is transparency and security and accessibility, is not what the left wants. They want, frankly, badly working systems that they can game, and so that cheaters can infiltrate their way in, because they believe that that's how they hold power.
Yeah, that's really what this is about. And in fact, I was having a conversation with a member of the Texas media yesterday about the border crisis, which maybe the three of us can talk about in another episode. And this gentleman, I'll take him to be a gentleman, but left of center, asked me what the end game is for the Biden administration not enforcing the border. And it's the same thing. And it is I argue, this organization believes, to infiltrate our voter rolls with people who shouldn't be voting. And we can go on and on with examples about that. But that in one way.
Hey, Kevin, can I hit that real quick?
Sure.
There's evidence of that. The evidence is in HR 1 and S1, where they literally, this is the federal legislation, folks, where they would literally mandate that states like Texas and every other state put every adult who shows up on their state databases. And remember, you don't have to be a citizen to show up in those databases. You can get a driver's license. You can show up to get a COVID vaccine. You can be in the education system. There's all sorts of ways that people who live in your state illegally get on those databases, millions of them. And HR 1 would have forcibly put those folks on the voter rolls and eliminated the criminal penalty for them voting. Think about that. Yep. They literally eliminate the criminal penalty for non-citizens, including illegal aliens, voting at the same time they mandate that millions of them be put on the voter rolls all over the country. So that's not just some conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
That is what their bill intended to do.
Yeah, it's in black and white. I really appreciate you hanging on that. It was sort of an intentional softball I was pitching you, and I'm glad you hit it. So, Garrett, we've got another great question from an audience member. And this is, what's the simplest argument against someone who says these election integrity efforts are racist? I presume they mean not in arguments in a courtroom, but in conversations with friends and neighbors.
Yeah, well, I mean, other than just saying, what's your proof or whatever, I mean, the easiest pushback is always to focus on the polling around voter ID. I mean, even in Georgia, again, sorry, I'm not trying to make this a call about Georgia, but even in Georgia, where there is an extremely potent opposition force led by an African-American woman in Stacey Abrams, voter ID and other similar provisions around that hold extraordinarily high with Black Georgians. And so when we're accused of that, we just constantly go back to the proof, and that is, look, first off, we want every American citizen who is eligible to vote to be able to cast their ballot with the assurance that it is being counted fairly, it is not being disqualified by an illegally cast ballot. And then secondly, here's some of the ways in which we believe that can be done. And by the way, here's the public polling to show that every single ethnic group, the majority of them support these things. And so how can you claim something is racist with those types of margins?
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I kind of alluded to it, before we went live on this call here, but when the litigation comes inevitably, I mean, we're caught up in litigation in Florida around the issue of race. And I think it's really important. I'm sure there's lots of people on this show right now that interact with their elected officials. It is really important to know that the left intends to expose all the communications that conservatives have with their elected officials, and that you aren't sloppy or flippant in how you talk about the reforms that you want to see, because they will very, very quickly, if they can gain subpoenas to your communications with your officials, turn your own words on the head and prove you to be something that you're not, including a race.
Yeah, this is really, really important reminder for all of us and all of our communication. Garrett, I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then Ken, one more is coming to you because we're getting to the end of our time. And Garrett, this is a ready-made question for the Vice President of Heritage Action for America. This audience member is asking, what can the everyday person do to get involved in this issue and help? Looks like we might have lost feed with Garrett. Ken, I'm gonna go to you and ask you to take that question. We'll reestablish our feed with Garrett. Garrett will come back to you if that's fixed. But Ken, you have really helped to cohere a lot of people, different groups. Right. What's your answer to that question? How can we make sure that we've not given up the fight and that someone who wants to help in this next phase can do so?
Yeah, it has never been more important that people contact both their state representatives, whatever state they're in, as well as their federal. For instance, I'll give you an example. HR 4 just came through the House. And interestingly enough, our focus wasn't so much on beating it per se, but making sure every single Republican at least knew what was in it. And we succeeded in that, and no Republicans voted for it. Whereas in the last Congress, that wasn't the case. Now, they did make HR 4 this time much worse than in the last Congress. They put a lot of really outrageous additional provisions in. But that's important because when it goes over to the Senate, part of the debate and what the left is trying to do is get the Democrats in the Senate to get rid of the filibuster to pass this bill. And you have an educated audience. I don't have to explain the filibuster, but going from 60 votes needed to 50 is an enormous difference in the viability of something like HR 4. So it not being bipartisan, and you compare that to the Voting Rights Act in 1965, a higher percentage of Republicans voted for the Voting Rights Act than Democrats in 1965. Part of the power of the Voting Rights Act, the moral authority, not just the legal authority, was how comprehensively around the country the support had been built for that action, because it was a very powerful act against a number of states, including yours and mine. Again, very appropriately at the time. Nonetheless, that is absolutely lacking from what the radical left is trying to do in Washington right now. And so you need to not just assume that because you happen to have a Republican senator or congressman, that they're going to be strong enough. You need to go push them. And I wouldn't give up on Democrats either. There are Democrats who recognize what's going on here. And by the way, I deal in some blue states, very blue states, where there's interesting dynamic. The older Democrats are afraid of the new little Marxists that are rolling into their party. They think they're going to use things like ballot trafficking to cheat. But they can't say it publicly. And they're trying to find ways to help what are nominally Republican bills work their way through. Now, that's a pretty tough tangle for them, but I've encountered that. That wasn't something I went looking for. It's a surprising result of what's out there. So in every state, even if you're in the deep blue Northeast watching us, you should still call your state representative and your federal representatives on this and let them know how you feel. Those calls do matter as they add up.
Yeah, excellent reminder. Garrett, I'm sure you would say much, if not all, of what Ken said. I want to give you the opportunity to answer a follow-up question to that. Where can viewers go on the web, elsewhere, to stay up to date with what's going on and be connected to efforts to participate in moving this effort forward?
Yeah, thanks. And I apologize. My Wi-Fi connection is unstable right this second. So
no sweat.
I'm going to do my best here. Election integrity is not just a fight about legislation. It is also an opportunity to be operational on the ground. And so, for example, Virginia and New Jersey have governor elections in a couple months. Get involved on the ground right now, because election integrity starts at the polling location itself. Become a poll worker, become a poll watcher, get involved. There's a huge coalition in Virginia that we are part of that are actively training poll workers and watchers right now. You can find that information for us on saveourelections.com. There's also information on that website that is about other states. So, for example, Michigan is potentially going to have a ballot initiative on voter ID. Arizona has a ballot initiative that they're working on voter ID as well. So that's one of the resources that we provide. I'm sure that Ken and TPPF have websites as well that contain those resources. But you can check out ours if you'd like, saveourelections.com. It's intended to be sort of a one-stop shop.
Well, Garrett Bess of Heritage Action, Ken Cuccinelli, thanks so much for your time. I know our audience appreciates your wisdom, your expertise, and your optimism. And that's really how I want to close our conversation. This is hard work. It's a heavy lift in terms of policy work. As I mentioned to our staff yesterday, when these Texas election bills were passed by both chambers and they'll be signed by Governor Abbott, a lot of people deserve credit. The two of you and your organizations, most importantly, the legislators who've been called racists for merely wanting to enact common sense reform. The point is, we're winning, and we're winning because we have coalesced around common sense ideas, around the truth, around what is good, and that's protecting the right of every American to cast their vote. And so I want you and the audience to know that if you've spent a big chunk of the last several months kind of being down in the dumps and depressed about the future of America, I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be concerned, but what I am going to tell you is that the future is bright. And one of the reasons is we're winning on this issue, and I believe we're going to win, as you've heard in this program. So, gentlemen, thanks again. Those of you in the audience, most of all, thank you. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of your hands, and may God bless America. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.